Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this day organized by La Casa Encendida together with the Transición Verde Foundation that will be composed of two sessions. Today's session will be on the crisis of the supply chain. And the question that we ask ourselves is whether this is just circumstantial or systematic. And from 6 until 7:30, we will be tackling this question. And on May 11th, at the same time, we will be talking about whether we are creating post-growth, a dialogue that will have Yayo Herrero and Tim Jackson participating. And during May 11th and today, you can participate with your questions via chat. You can write down your questions on this chat in this forum where you're connected right now. And we have chosen this theme because we currently have a supply crisis globally that will obviously is worsened by the Russian invasion in Ukraine, microchips, glass bottles, cardboard packages, fiberglass, resins, aluminum, a long list that is very much linked to the prices of energy going up, something that we're all suffering right now in our homes, and that has caused for fertilizing factories to close and for different plants all over Europe to close. And there's also a problem with world transportation because freight costs have gone up, they have rocketed up, and with problems with lorry drivers and ship captains. My name is Laura Ojea. I specialize in energy in El Español Invertia, and I have two exceptional experts. We have Antonio Turiel, who is a scientist with a degree in mathematics and theoretical physics, and he's an expert, as I'm sure you all know, in energy resources and a researcher for the FESIC at the Institute of Sea Sciences. He's also known as a scientist teacher. He uses a blog, All Grass, where he talks about the situation of fossil fuels and their possible consequences worldwide on economy and society. And he is the author of the book Petrocalypsis, which he wrote 2 years ago, and the co-author of The Autumn of Civilization. And I am sure that he will be talking to us about today about his research about the end of the era of fossil fuels, cheap fossil fuels and abundant fossil fuels. And also in English, we will have Richard Heinberg, who is a member of the Post-Carbon Institute, and he is considered as one of the main promoters worldwide of the need to abandon our current dependence of fossil fuels. And he is the author of hundreds of essays and 14 books, amongst which we find some of the most important works on the current energy crisis and sustainability, environmentally sustainable or environmental crisis. There is power limits for human survival, and he was in different documentaries and movies and television documentaries such as The 11th Power. We will be listening to him via simultaneous translation because we have an icon. There's a world icon in the lower part of your screen where you can choose the channel in which you want to listen to translation. And with no further ado, we will now start with the most important part of today's session, which is giving the floor to each of the authors who will be the ones commenting. They are the experts who will be commenting some of the most important parts of their presentations about this future and this crisis of the supply chain. So we will start with you, Antonio Turiel. Please go ahead. Antonio, can you hear me? I'm sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now? So what is happening, Antonio, currently with the supply chain, and what are the causes, the economical causes and structural causes behind the current situation? Well, we have been describing supply chain problems based on circumstantial, accidental reasons during these last 2 years. Firstly, obviously, we had the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdown measures that were taken that caused for a fall in consumption, a drastic fall of consumptions of all raw materials. When we started reinitiating the economic activity, especially after the summer of 2020 with much strength, there was a real difficulty of reactivating many industrial processes, and in many factories we had laid people off because we didn't know whether we were going to be able to maintain their positions. We didn't know what the situation would be, and then it was very hard to hire them back. And I think that the pandemic has also created a sort of feeling that we really were not doing things that fulfilled us, things that we thought were important, and that has caused for a movement in the US mainly and in other countries as well, which is called the Great Resignation. People leaving their jobs because they aspired to do something else, something different that they did not aspire to previously. And in 2021, we started seeing a different phenomenon. We started talking about bottlenecks in supply. We started talking about the difficulty to move goods around. But then little by little, step by step, we started seeing an idea that was kind of in between the lines in discussions, which was the increase of transportation costs. In maritime transportation and road transportation, it went up, and prices are not usually constant. They change, but we are consistently seeing that the prices are 2, 3, or even 6 times or even 10 times greater than they used to be before the pandemic. And as I said, despite oscillations in prices and changes in prices, they are still very, very high compared to what we were used to. And these problems with prices generate a certain situation. For instance, we started seeing that there were no lorry drivers, we didn't have any drivers, and we didn't have people who could unload containers in harbors because the increase of costs for transportation led to a degrowth or a decrease of salaries, and companies did that so that they could maintain their commercial margins. So people wouldn't be willing to do that job, and that caused some problems. And all of this part, the increase of costs, has an energy root to it, and it's not unexpected at all. Many years ago, I realized that fossil fuel fuels that we were getting from oil were going to start not being available, especially diesel, because hydrocarbons, all the liquids that come from oil, such as classic oils and non-conventional oils, these mixes are starting to change their chemical composition, and that was going to affect diesel mainly because the hydrocarbons or shorter chain hydrocarbons are easier to do, but diesel is a bit more sophisticated, and although we can produce it with any conventional oil or not conventional oil, their production price is different and the cost is different. So obviously diesel was going to suffer before everybody else, every other hydrocarbon. So in 2017 we had the maximum production, then the production was maintained stable until 2018, but from 2018 onwards it started falling, and it fell around 15% now, and that is generating a lack of diesel. That is also having an impact on maritime transportation, because with the new maritime legislation that was in force since January 1st, 2020, the fuel used by boat needs to have a lesser volume of sulfur. So they obviously have to use diesel. And as I said, we have a series of reasons that are overlapping. Some are circumstantial, but other are long-lasting, with a phenomenon that had started previously, that started in 2018, 2019. And that is also picking up pace, which is this lack of fuels that are used in transportation and for machinery. I'm sorry, I was muted as well in order not to cause any background noises. Richard, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Without cheap energy, growth cannot be sustained. But that is still the main political objective, isn't it? For instance, in 1972, we published the report, The Limits of Growth, that was commissioned by the Club of Rome. And years after, the dominant narrative is still that growth is the only road to follow. But what is the current situation? What are the main discourses, or what are the most decisive limits? Not just growth, but also the stability of the system itself.
Well, as you mentioned, it's 50 years since the publication of The Limits to Growth. It was at the time the best-selling environmental book. In fact, it sold 12 million copies. It's been hugely influential. And yet at the same time, policymakers disregarded the implications of the study. They were persuaded to do so by economists who felt deeply threatened by the idea that there could be limits to growth. I recently went back, reread the study, interviewed one of the main authors, surviving authors, Dennis Meadows, and I'll put a link in the chat box to those articles. But what struck me was that from the very beginning, the authors of the study were looking at depletion of resources and pollution as being the most likely limits to future economic growth. And of course, that's the modeling exercise that they undertook was quite complex, and I'm not going to try to describe it all here. But this notion of depletion and pollution as the essential limits to growth was very important. And in the 50 years since then, there has been a shifting emphasis on the part of policymakers on how to understand and prioritize these two limits. Now, of course, many policymakers disregard the very idea of limits. And so for them, this is just a theoretical exercise of no importance. But for the more, I would say, responsible policymakers, the notion of pollution as a limit to growth has taken root to a much greater degree than depletion, I'd say, especially in recent years. And of course, climate change, which is essentially a pollution issue, the pollutant being greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide, methane, and so on, has become a centerpiece of global public policy. All policymakers at least give lip service to the idea of climate change and the necessity of doing something to prevent catastrophic climate change. But depletion hasn't gone away. In fact, even the things that we need to do to prevent catastrophic climate change are things that will likely worsen the problem of depletion just in different sectors. Right now, the depletion problem is most serious in the fossil fuel sector, where we're depleting high-grade sources of petroleum and natural gas. With coal, it's a slower process, but it's going on even with regard to coal. It's not that we are completely running out of these resources, but we've extracted and burned the highest quality, easiest to access fuels. And so what's left is our fuels that are getting more difficult to extract, requiring more energy for their extraction and processing. And in some cases, they're also more polluting. Okay, so the solution to climate change is to switch away from fossil fuels to other sources of energy. So what are the available alternatives? Well, of course, there's nuclear power, but that requires uranium, which is another depleting resource. And in fact, it's the amounts that are available are quite limited. Then there is solar and wind. These are called renewables because they rely upon sunlight and wind, which can't be depleted in any meaningful sense in human timescales. But in order to capture the energy from sunlight and wind, we need physical structures, solar panels, wind turbines, and these are made from depleting materials, high grade silicon, concrete, which is made from cement and sand, aluminum, a whole range of chemicals, some of which are rare, some relatively common. But if we envision replacing fossil fuels over the next 2 or 3 decades at current scale of global energy usage, the amount of these materials that we would need would be extraordinary. And in fact, the problem of depletion would be very much at hand. Just with a material like lithium, which is used in making lithium ion batteries. There may be enough lithium out there to enable us to build the first generation of energy storage capacity that we would need. But then what do we do for the next generation, which might be only 20 years after that? And with material after material, it's the same situation. So even though we have focused on the problem of depletion, even though we have focused on the problem of pollution in the form of climate change, the problem of depletion has not gone away, and in fact is just as serious a limit on further economic growth as it ever has been, and actually much more so than it has been in the past. So there is really no way that we can continue to ignore the overall limits on growth. Policymakers have tried to do that simply by disregarding one of the two categories of limits, but that doesn't work anymore. We are at a turning point where if we don't collectively acknowledge these limits and start planning to degrow the economy, then the limits will force themselves upon us, and our choices will be fewer and fewer as time goes on.
Very interesting what Richard said, and actually that forces us to ask Antonio the following question. So how is this affecting this lack of supply? How is it affecting the energy crisis, the diesel crisis and gas natural crisis? And mainly a question that we all have to ask ourselves, whether we are in the brink of a food crisis, of a world food crisis. Well, before we continue, although I really liked Richard's introduction because it actually introduces my answer, because there are two scales. You asked me about the short-term scale, which is what's happening right now, but we have to also consider the long-term scale. So we are getting to the maximum of production for many raw materials, energy raw materials, non-renewable raw materials, and this is obviously starting to affect raw materials of other sectors, of other kinds. So when we think about short-term scales, when we think about what happened in the last few months and what is foreseeable to happen in the next few years, we have a situation where this scarcity, this sudden scarcity, well, it's not really sudden, but it's sudden for Western countries, let's say, that has been felt in many countries for 4 years, more or less. We cannot say that it has started now. So this sudden drop in diesel production is having lots of effects that are waterfall effects. And the first effect, we've already mentioned it, it is the fact that transportation prices have gone up. The second effect is closing certain mines, because there are mines that require too much diesel to be operated. Mining operations work better when they're electrified, but not all places allow for that to happen. we can't electrify all operations. So we see that certain projects, for instance, coal mines and uranium mines, as well as other materials, have had to close. They are being closed due to the fact that we don't have diesel, and diesel is too expensive for them to use them. And we need to understand the difference between the fact that diesel is becoming pricier. We've seen that here in Europe, in the US, suddenly the price per liter or per gallon, it becomes too expensive. But then there is a second situation that has been seen in some countries where it's not that it is expensive, but rather that there isn't enough and they are rationing it. So that is creating problems in the stability of certain countries. For instance, the situation that we currently have in Peru, when people complain because everything is more expensive, but also because there is a scarcity, and there is a scarcity of food as well. And the government has declared the status of emergency, and they have limited mobility to people, and now they have to be at home most of the day. We also have the situation of Argentina, where they are harvesting, especially soy, the soy that is being used as fodder for livestock in Spain and other countries, and also as feedstock or main raw materials for the production of biodiesel. For instance, 1/4 of our biodiesel comes from Argentinian soy. So in Argentina, they did not have enough diesel during this harvesting campaign, to the extent that 10 to 20% of the diesel that they would consume has been rationed because they didn't have it. And that led them to a situation where part of the harvest was going to be lost. In the end, they got more diesel from the international markets. But according to what people who work there have told me, the prices have doubled. So the costs obviously will also be increased, and this will have devastating consequences in the international markets. And we have also the Sri Lankan situation. Sri Lanka is a country that people would visit as a touristic destination that started with a very serious diesel crisis. And at a certain point, India had to send some urgent shipments to try and solve the situation in Sri Lanka. In the end, they used up all of the diesel. They had electricity cuts, and that happens in many countries actually, because energy sources are needed for the stability of their electric network and their electric grid. And they were in a situation of collapse, and now strikes are constant, and the government has fallen, and so on. Now, the situation of Pakistan is even more worrisome. Pakistan is a country with 220 million inhabitants with atomic nuclear weapons, and they are having problems to have diesel brought to them. And the diesel price is intervened by the government in Pakistan, and obviously many companies cannot sell diesel in Pakistan because there is scarcity, so they don't find it attractive or interesting. So the diesel reserves in Pakistan are at a minimum level, and that they only have supply for a couple of days. They're always at the brink of disaster, and they're suffering a lot to maintain that. So in Pakistan, we are in a situation where they're cutting light for 10 hours every day, and that is creating a problem with food supply as well. And that has been combined with a heat wave without precedents that has affected both India and Pakistan in this last week. That has not ended yet. That heat wave will obviously kill many people. And during all of these challenges, Pakistan has reacted by bombing Afghanistan, because what's better than a war to try and get people to think about something else? That's with regards to diesel. So diesel is creating lots of problems with scarcity and increase in prices. And there's also scarcity of fuel for planes, that's kerosene. And how does that happen? Well, because when we adjust the prices in refineries, then we could increase the production of diesel by reducing the production of kerosene. So kerosene is not so used worldwide. The production of diesel is around 25, 27% of all the refinery products, but kerosene is around 6%. So in order to increase diesel, you have to lower kerosene quite a bit. And that's one of the reasons why the production of kerosene is going down. And the other reason that cannot be mentioned out loud is the fact that kerosene is being mixed with diesel. Kerosene is a more powerful fuel than diesel. You can put a certain amount, but not so much, because the limits of safety are around 10 to 20%, depending on the authorities, and obviously that reduces the life of diesel engines because the erosion is greater when you use kerosene, because the combustion of these mixture within the cylinder is very eroding, and that is creating a reduction of kerosene. So suddenly we're in a situation where the price of tickets, airline tickets, are more expensive, and there have been problems in some airports in the US. So this is a problem that is generalizing. And there is another problem that is also connected to diesel. It has an origin that is partly different, which is the food crisis, what you were asking about, Laura. So at the beginning of the current crisis, during the summer last year, summer 2021, we saw that the main factor was the increase in prices of diesel due to the increase of prices of machinery and so on. But last fall, we had a different effect. The increase of prices of natural gas and their scarcity led to a reduction of production of fertilizing agents. We know that we have nitrogens, protease, and phosphates for all sorts of cultures, and cytogenated are being done by the Haber-Bosch process by using a chemical base, and an important part of this is being done with a saturated gas, 50 to 40 to 50% of the nitrogenated fertilizers are created with natural gas. But since there was no natural gas, then there was a problem with the supply of fertilizing agents in Europe. Many factories closed in Europe for a few weeks or even a few months. And when they opened again, they did not open at full capacity. They were producing less than they would be producing previously, and it was more expensive. And they had contracts that had to be guaranteed by the client, saying that they were going to purchase it at a certain amount. And this obviously is creating problems for farmers who have to pay more for diesel and more for their fertilizers. So in this context, we found ourselves in a situation where China, in September last year, decided to reduce 90% of their fertilizing agents. And we find ourselves in a situation where Russia forbids all exports from January 1st. That was 3 weeks before they invaded the Ukraine, until March 31st. But obviously, they have extended that prohibition due to the current context. And then there is a waterfall problem. FAO has warned since October last year that there was going to be a problem and a food crisis that was linked to the shortage in food in general. The World Bank a few weeks ago warned that we went from a food crisis situation, to a humanitarian catastrophe situation, and 40% of the world population could be threatened by this catastrophic situation. And the problem is that this has just started. This problem has just started because now we're finding ourselves with many, many different consequences, waterfall consequences. The problems that Argentina is facing to harvest its soy, we have to add that to Kazakhstan's problems. It is a very unstable country where Russian troops had to intervene to maintain the president in power. He is, a dictator from a Soviet republic. You know how that works. And because there was much revolt in the streets, there were many problems, and also because prices were going up. Well, Kazakhstan would do something. They would import cheap wheat from Russia, and then they would export their wheat at a higher price. And Russia had followed a policy for 20 years where they would sell their wheat very, very cheaply to old Soviet republics, especially those that were loyal to them. And then Russia decided not to export wheat anymore once the war started, because they were leaving it aside for them because they weren't sure of the national context. And that obviously has an impact in Kazakhstan. But and they suddenly see that they don't have flour, they don't have wheat, and they have to suspend their exports. And this is having an important impact in many countries, especially Afghanistan, and also Egypt, which is another country that is much affected by the war in Ukraine. And one of the factors was the war of Ukraine. We're talking about a country, the Ukraine, that has 40 million inhabitants and that produces food for 600 million, thanks to their fertile lands, because those black lands of the Ukraine are very fertile. And this is leading to a situation where there is a lack of cereal and sunflower oil in many countries. And if that wasn't enough, we find ourselves in a situation where China announces that their harvest is going to be limited this year. It's going to be worse than expected, and that will have an impact on their exports. And what would be the cherry on top of things would be the announcement made by Indonesia, which is the main producer of palm oil the world over and the main palm oil exporter. And the palm oil here in Spain is being used in certain foods, but it's not really very much used. It's the main oil, vegetable oil consumed by humans the world over. It actually represents 60% of vegetable oils in the world. And Indonesia represents 30% of the consumption of vegetable oil the world over. So Indonesia, since May 1st, last Sunday, suspended completely its exports of palm oil. And that is due to the increase of prices for production. They're afraid of not being able to cover their needs because Indonesia is a very big country with 270 million inhabitants and other reasons. Maybe there can be a speculation component, but we have the feeling that there is a serious problem there. And this actually draws a very worrisome picture for the next few months. We're not talking about years, we're talking just about months. I'm not talking about decades or years. I have to say that the speed with which all of this has been developed has surprised me. I expected a slow descent situation that would take years or decades, but I think that the policies, the short-term policies, and the short-sightedness of political leaders worldwide are making the situation worse. A situation that should not be as complicated as it is being, but that's what has forced for this to happen. And if we keep on having this paradigm of growth, we will have a very important risk. I mean, these problems will become unnecessarily serious, and obviously, due to the complexity and the situation in the system, they will make many, many domino chips go down. So, what Professor Dobardi calls a Seneca cliff, a too fast a fall, which in this case, I insist, is due to human decisions being made. And that does not mean that, I mean, maybe it's something that was unstoppable due to human idiocy or the way in which we organize ourselves. I hope not, because as a technician, I hope, I trust that at a certain point we will all collectively use our common sense and react and start doing things better. But nowadays, since we're talking about the short term, unfortunately, that's the situation we're in. And the perspective is that it will be complicated even further in the next few months if there isn't a call to action for global cooperation. Okay, let's hope common sense rules worldwide and the great political leaders do react, because the context we find ourselves in with this Russian invasion of the Ukraine, it seems that we're not following the right path, are we? So, Richard, you wrote in an article recently that this Russian invasion and the Western response to it are leading the world to a new energy era, a new political era. What does that mean in the energy sector, since we've already talked about the serious situation we're in with regards to food crisis?
Right. Well, Russia is a major supplier of natural gas and oil to much of the rest of the world, particularly Europe, and also to some Asian countries. Russia's supply of oil represents something like 9% of global supply, and already something like 3 million barrels a day of Russian supplies, actually more than that, are being constrained either by direct embargoes or by other kinds of logistical factors. So that's roughly 4% of world oil supply that's been taken off the market. And we have to look at this in context that the global oil and natural gas supplies are very finely balanced between supply and demand. The assumption on the part of many policymakers and economists is that if there's a sudden shortage in one part of the market, it's very easy just to turn on the tap and produce more and make up for that in some other part of the world. But that's really not the case. In oil markets, for example, the assumption is that OPEC can simply turn on the spigot and produce more oil at any given moment. But that's not really true anymore. It was to a much greater extent a few decades ago, but these days, not so much. The big oil fields of the Middle East are roughly half depleted. And what that means is that, of course, there's still lots of oil left in the ground, but it's getting more difficult, costly to extract that oil, and the oil reservoirs have to be managed more carefully. So if there's a sudden effort to increase the rate of extraction from some of these reservoirs, it will actually damage the reservoirs in terms of potential for future supply. So the managers of these oil fields, the oil producing countries like Saudi Arabia, don't want to do that, understandably, because this is their source of future wealth. So they have, for the most part, not increased their rate of supply significantly in the face of the global shortage that we've been talking about. Well, the other likely source of new supply would be the United States. Over the last decade, the US has produced dramatically more oil as a result of the use of new technologies, hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling, relatively new technologies. They've actually been around for some time. But applying these technologies to resources that were previously marginal or questionable. The geologists call them tight oil. And the reason for that is these are reservoirs where the oil is locked in very small pores in the rock. And so it's necessary to explode the rock and extract the oil. The result is that the rate of extraction tends to be very high in the early phases of this mode of production. And then it tapers off very rapidly afterward. So this requires a very high rate of drilling. And the areas where this is going on, which are discrete areas within the US in North Dakota, Texas, Colorado, and so on. Within these areas, it's only possible to produce oil profitably in very small sections, just a few square miles sometimes in each of these areas. And those small sweet spots are being filled with wells, to the point that there's very little room for new wells. So this miracle of increased production that the US has seen over the last decade, several million barrels per day of new production, to the point where the US has become the world's top oil producer again, as it was in the early 20th century, but its production had declined dramatically since 1970. But now it's increased again to the point where US oil production has even surpassed its level back in 1970. That was really an extraordinary accomplishment. The assumption has been that this could continue and that the US could make up for shortfalls elsewhere. But the shortage is coming at a very bad time in terms of the this trajectory of production within the US because it's hit its maximum and has already started to decline. So the U.S. is not able to make up for the global shortage, and really, when you go around to country after country, oil-producing countries, there's no realistic candidate for a source that will be able to make up for the global petroleum shortage that is causing this diesel shortage that Dr. Turiel was talking about. So I'm just looking over my notes right now. Oh yeah, there's one other point I wanted to make, which is that very early in the Ukraine-Russia conflict, U.S. oil companies pulled out of Russia, and actually international oil companies in general. So we're talking about Shell, ExxonMobil, all of these large, important companies that had been working in Russia, providing technical help to Russian oil companies for their domestic production. Now, Russian oil production had probably already peaked around 2020 anyway. This is according to the Russian oil ministry. But the Russian oil industry was depending upon foreign expertise to maintain production at relatively high levels and manage the decline over the coming decades. But now that expertise is gone. And so the likelihood is that Russian oil production is going to decline much faster than would otherwise have been the case. So we have two intersecting problems. One is the short-term problem of the war itself and the political and economic circumstances of the war, the embargoes on Russian oil and natural gas exports and so on. And then on the other hand, we have this longer term, deeper problem of the fact that these resources are finite and depleting over a longer historic period. And we are just reaching that phase where depletion is becoming a real issue anyway, even without having to consider the immediate crisis of the war and its other attendant problems. So the two are exacerbating each other. These two sources of supply difficulty are exacerbating each other and making it difficult to find answers, alternatives, solutions. And unfortunately, so far it appears that the policymakers are more or less blind to the longer term implications and are floundering around looking just for short-term fixes.
Bueno, escuchando a ambos expertos,
listening to both our experts seems to be quite grim, the situation we face. But I do have lots of questions that I could ask, but I think that we should maybe give the floor to those of you listening, those of you who have written your questions on the chat. And I encourage you all to write questions because there are some very interesting questions, and I'm going to try and link those questions. For instance, there was a question for Antonio Turiel. Rafa was asking whether an organized degrowth is feasible if it is not being done globally. Well, I think, let's see. Actually, what we've been talking about here, the situation that we reached the limits of resources, it has increased the functionality of our economic system because it's subject to this. It is under stress, and I think that each country will have to organize its degrowth in its own way, depending of its own circumstances. So I think that the ideal situation would be for a global degrowth movement. Obviously, if we could organize that degrowth, but I think it will be very difficult to do it at a global level. Why? Well, because there is always mistrust and so on. So it's going to be difficult to have a national degrowth, and it will be even more difficult to have a global degrowth. And you also have to think that what allowed for this globalization and this interconnection was actually the fact that we had abundant and cheap energy. And now we're in a scenario where energy will not be abundant and will not be as cheap. So that might cause a relocalization process, which is something that we're already observing. We see that some companies are trying to redeploy their activity, and we will have a political reorganization, not just a productive reorganization. So if we could have a degrowth organized system, I hope it is the case. But if it does happen, I think it will be done locally, country by country. Yes, actually, he had a second part of his question, and he was saying that if one country decides to degrow, they could be eaten up by a hostile neighbor, which is what you tried to say, right, Antonio? Yes, but then there is another, yes, being eaten up by a hostile neighbor. Let's remember that modern war eats up many resources. I mean, war has always eaten up resources, but now the energy return, energy investment of war is not positive. It's never positive, especially with Dominion wars. So I think that that scenario, which is obviously possible, I mean, there could be conflicts and mistrust, but I don't think it will be a standard scenario. Where I see more problems, invasion wars, would be Europe towards Africa. Actually, Europe with this warring movement that we have seen since the Ukraine, and this rearmament of European countries might favor in the future that we go towards Africa when resources are missing or are scarce here in Europe. That might be the temptation to try and find for those resources in the north of Africa. But in any case, I think that our days are counted because war is very expensive, and Russia is seeing that war has a very, very high cost. And this is not the wars that we see in video games. This is real, and things in the real world are more difficult and more painful, obviously. Yes, yes, we see that there is lots of suffering, that's for sure. And Richard, you're being asked if in a world where growth, economic growth, is the political mantra and the main economical mantra, where basically no politician and no media will ever talk about the taboo of degrowth, of economic degrowth. What's the best strategy to try and progressively introduce this debate in our?
I think the issue has to be forced by circumstance, and we are seeing that happen as we've been talking about. The global economy is bumping up against limits in real time, and we have to speak about that as much as we can with our colleagues, with elected officials, locally, nationally. There are certain topics that are just taboo. Limits to growth is one. The very word depletion very rarely is mentioned in normal discourse in the public media and the news and so on, even though it's a profound influence on global events and will have profound influence on the remainder of our lives, and yet we don't talk about it. So I think there is a kind of epiphany about degrowth that is waiting to occur. The thing is, this is not a concept that requires a degree in higher mathematics in order to understand it. We live on a finite planet. Our population and consumption have been growing rapidly for the last 100 years and a little bit more. Well, how long can this process of growth continue before depletion and pollution start to impose limits? Well, there's abundant evidence that depletion and pollution are starting to impose limits in real time. This is not, again, this is not rocket science. It's just necessary that we start discussing it more in public settings. And I don't know of any way to do that other than for those of us who are aware to use our voices, talk to our colleagues, even in environmental circles where the discussion has been almost entirely about climate change. I think it's important to discuss also these larger issues beyond just pollution, which taken by itself, the assumption has been for many in the environmental movement that we can solve climate change with renewable energy and continue to grow the economy. Realistically, that's not going to happen. And that's an epiphany that is waiting to occur. And it's important that the sort of bubble of expectations of future growth be burst as soon as possible, because the longer it continues to inflate, the fewer our options will be. So let's all wake up together. Let's have the epiphany.
Bueno, es que probablemente, no sé, Richard.
Probably, I don't know, Richard confirms what has been said. Politicians are not understanding this message because they don't dare take this seriously. They don't dare take this idea of degrowth seriously because they would lose votes. And it has also been said that the media, and I count myself as one of them, avoid talking about that in all seriousness because they're financed by energy industries, by pharma, by big pharma, by the automotive sector. Do we all contribute to this ostrich strategy?
Yes, of course. Yes, of course. All of these are contributors, and I would put economists right at the front of the parade because their discipline. The whole field of economics was developed during this last 100 years of rapid growth, and so that the field of economics has incorporated within it the assumption that growth is normal, that growth is good, that it can always proceed. And economists are, in effect, the priesthood of the modern industrial world. They have this set of beliefs that they've developed. They pretend to be scientists. Actually, economics is not a science in the true sense, even though it uses mathematics and graphs and so on, and some scientific concepts. The basic underlying assumptions of economics are not tested in controlled experiments. They're just assumptions. Assumptions about private property, assumptions about economic growth, and so on. So part of what has to happen is that we need to begin questioning this priesthood and the control that they exert over politicians. In many cases, politicians are, yes, they're looking for votes, but they've been educated in many cases at schools of economics, and they believe this stuff.
Bueno, hay un tema también del que se ha hablado en los últimos
There is also something that has been mentioned in this last few months, thanks to the study that was published by Antonio Turiel on the possibility of facing the moment of the end of cheap energy and the depletion of the minerals needed for an energy transition. Antonio, why didn't we act before? Why are we talking about that now, that scarcity? And why didn't we talk about that years ago when we knew that there was going to be that scarcity? Well, that's what we have been saying for a very long time. 50 years ago, we knew that this was going to happen. And we knew that it was going to happen more or less now in the 21st century. We knew it. So in the last few months, I have had the possibility of talking to to people in the world of politics and who have decision-making power, the impression that I get, and making the link with what Richard has just said, I think that people who have been trained, have been classically trained in economics and in Spain, the normal profile in politics is economics. I mean, people come from economics and from law. That's where they come from usually. And they all have this idea that it's all transactional, that everything can be agreed upon, that there can always be a social pact, but nature does not negotiate. Nature has no obligation to satisfy whatever needs we think we have or whatever we think can be satisfied. And nature does not have that obligation to satisfy them. So the impression that I usually get, and mainly now that we see that problems are really present, is that they're still in a phase of negotiation. They're negotiating with nature, and for most of these decades, what they've been waiting for was that people who work in the technological world and scientific world would provide them with that magical solution, that we would do our magic. And I've said it very often with the next generation funds and with that amazing amount of money that comes from Europe. Well, we're seeing that there is a reduction of expenses in health, because we have seen a reduction in health expenses and education expenses. We see that in the world of science, that they're giving us a very meager amount, and they're giving us a very little amount, and we have the difficulty in the world of science to absorb the meager amount that they're giving us, because it's so much more than we were usually given. But now they say, now you have to fix everything. We're giving you all this money because we need you to solve everything and give us a magical solution. And they're giving us an amount of money that we can't absorb. We're not capable of absorbing. To do the job that I do, I have to train people. And training a person at the level that we train them in the world of research, it takes 10 years. So, and I always tell the same joke. I say that an economist is a man, always a man who thinks that if a woman can have a child in 9 months, then 9 women can have a child in 1 month. It's absurd, but that's the way in which they think. So I think that there has been quite a bit of negotiation. People thought that the techno-scientific world would provide them with a miraculous solution. And there is a book actually that talks of searching for a miracle. And we're still looking for that miracle. And there is something that we don't understand, which is the fact that if there were something simple, if there were something really versatile, if there was something that really produced much energy, we would have integrated it. The economic system would have integrated it, because they would have had more productivity. So, for instance, with hydroelectrics, with the renewable energies is the one that performs best. We started using it in the 20th century. We had the main electrical centrals were hydroelectrics, and we are not integrating new technologies because they don't have the same performance, and they give many problems. For instance, we see a problem because many hydro generator manufacturers have seen a decrease in their income, such as Gamesa, and they're closing down their factories because it's not as profitable as we thought it was. So we are still there. We're still in that phase, that negotiation phase. But what I am detecting, and this is a contrast with the US. In Europe, we have insisted for a very long time in decarbonization policies and the implementation of different policies to fight against climate change. And this has gone to a second stage. And now I think that the idea of energy security will be the main idea, to not depend on the Russians, really, what we're saying previously. And then we will say not depend of external sources, although you will have to depend materially from other places, because sometimes the materials come from outside of our borders. And usually they come from countries where they do not respect human rights. So that's where we are. We're waiting for a miracle. And I think that is what politicians want. So that's the political cycle. When a politician is voted, they're voted for 4 years, and they want to be there for 4 years, and they will hold on to the power as long as they can, and whomever comes after will try to fix those solutions, or that's what they think. This is a question that Angel Cano is asking, although I wonder about this as well, and I'm asking you both. after talking about all of these things, what are the alternatives? Because we all want to maintain our current well-being, but maybe what we have to accept is that there will be a collapse with problems that this entails. I don't know who would like to answer this question. Maybe Richard, you would like to begin? I don't know. What options do we have currently?
The most important thing is that we face the looming shortages in a way that is cooperative and planned, because otherwise it will lead to a kind of rapid collapse, as Antonio was saying earlier. So we need planning and we need cooperation in dealing with shortages. Now, there's a simple strategy that societies have used again and again to deal with shortages in a way that incorporates cooperation and planning, and that's called rationing. So we need to begin rationing energy, food, and other necessities, and to do it in a way that's transparent, in a way that has some sort of long-term perspective attached to it. So, for example, with fossil fuels, we know that fossil fuels will be less available as a result of depletion. We also know that we need to use less of oil, natural gas, and coal because they're polluting the atmosphere and causing climate change. So we should be setting global caps on the production of oil, natural gas, and coal that are annually declining caps on production, and then ration both production and consumption of these fuels. That would be the sensible way to proceed. You ration production by issuing production permits to companies that extract fossil fuels. And those permits would be annually declining and they would be transferable. So companies could sell their permits to other companies that have better production prospects and so on. Then you also ration consumption. That ensures that everyone has the minimum that they need in order to survive. And those permits are also transferable. So people who receive consumption permits, if they don't use the entire amount of the permit, they can sell it to someone else and thereby benefit from being a conservative user of oil or whatever the resource is. This has been outlined and studied to some extent by an organization in Britain. It's a system called Tradable Energy Quotas, or TEQS. And if you simply Google those letters, TEQS, you get a full explanation of what the system would look like. It's possible that system could be extended, modified, improved in various ways, but much of the conceptual work has already been done. And this is going to be needed not just for fossil fuels, but also obviously for the other things we've been talking about, food, water, minerals. We are facing over the coming decades shortages in all of these things. And if we simply fight over what's left, that's the worst of all possible outcomes. We get to the best of possible outcomes only by planning and cooperation and sharing what's left.
Antonio?
Bueno, yo sobre lo que dice Richard añadir.
I think that I would simply add something to what Richard has said. We have also mentioned another taboo word, which is rationing. It's true. It's obvious. We have to ration things because there isn't enough. It's obvious. There isn't enough to maintain the consumption patterns that we have. But obviously, we are clashing with the free market concept because we're limiting people. We are limiting people to trade freely with objects and goods and so on. And that could favor abuses and could favor problems. But I don't have an exact answer. I don't have an exact answer on how this rationing should take place. But I think that it's always a political measure. Because if you ration things, obviously you will say this person is going to spend more, this person is going to spend less. I'm making decisions, and I'm making decisions on over the basis of what I think will be better for the society, and who has more right to consume and who has less right to consume. So we will also have to decide what the vital consumption is, or what the vital levels of consumption are. Now, as for the technical side, which is the one that I know better, there are different studies, such as the one that says that we could maintain a level of life such as the one that we have if we consumed a tenth of what we're currently consuming in Spain. I'm talking about materials as well as energy. I'm talking about a 20th of what we consume in the US. But that would involve to change our economic system and our production system and our social organization. There are many examples of how one of these systems could be put in place. For instance, in the case of Europe, where people usually live in cities with, big buildings. I, for instance, live in a flat, in an apartment flat. You don't have the need of having one fridge in every apartment as we do in Spain. In the US, it's not so normal, but here each house has its own washing machine. That is not normal in the US. So you don't need a washing machine in each apartment. You don't need a fridge in each flat. We could maybe share those resources. And then the consumption models need to change as well, because that's one of the main problems that we have. And that is what leads us to scarcity of resources. But this need that manufacturers have for you to change your washing machine or your shirt every X days or months so that they can maintain their business. So we have to fight against programmed obsolescence. For instance, I always give the same example, that of the washing machine. For instance, if a washing machine has 3 years warranty, then the manufacturer will want for it to stop working when it's 3 years and 1 day old, so that you buy a new one. But if you change the consumption model and you pay rent to the manufacturer, and when the machine does not work, he has to indemnify you for each day that machine is not working, then I'm sure that the manufacturer will take whatever measures are necessary for that machine to be easily repaired, for the parts to be easily found and easily changed. So there is much theory issued about this, about ecologic economy and stationary economy, and those are actually the lines that we should follow. But technically it is possible, but it requires an in-depth reform of all of this. Okay, so there are so many questions. There are lots of questions from our participants. I'm going to ask you one specific question that has been repeated twice. I think that it is quite interesting. It is Roger who asks to Antonio Turiel, do you think that the ITER project could be reliable source of energy in the midterm? Not in the midterm, because the proponents of the project are saying that it will not be available until 35 years. So they're always thinking about the next 50 years. You have to understand that in the initial project, they would create a reactor, the ITER, that would have to solve certain technical problems, and with that knowledge, they would create the new reactor, which would be the proto that will be used to solve other problems that could be solved, and that would allow us to get enough knowledge to get to the third stage, which would be the third reactor. And that would be 50 years, and now they're trying to reduce it to 35 by merging proto and demo phases. There are many reasons to understand that this will never be available, because there are some physical problems that can seem unsurmountable, but we don't know what will happen. But what is sure is that it will not give any results in the short term. Okay, so there is a question beside the questions by the audience that I would like to tackle. I would like to ask this question to both of you, because you've talked about circular economy, you've talked about obsolescence. The European Union has already set up some directives for devices to be reused once their useful life has ended, and to deprogram that programmed obsolescence. Do you think that is a solution or just a patch? just a band-aid. Richard, what do you think about it? Or Antonio, whomever wishes to take.
Yes, well, it's not a full solution, but it's part of the overall strategy that we need to begin to apply. The overall strategy is to reduce consumption and make what we do consume last longer, or I mean, obviously some things are directly consumed, like fossil fuels, and once they're burned, they're gone forever and so on. But when we use material resources like minerals and so on to make machinery or goods, we should make them so that they'll last as long as possible and be as useful as possible. So our goal should not be right now. Our economy is structured in such a way as to encourage consumption. We want to continually increase the flow through of material and energy through the economy so as to produce profits, returns on investment, jobs, and so on. It's entirely understandable how all of this happened, but it only happened because it was possible due to this one-time only influx of cheap energy. Now that cheap energy is gone, the whole equation has changed. It's the circumstances that enabled and encouraged economic growth have changed. They're gone. So we need to change all of the incentives that are embedded in the system. So rather than incentivizing more consumption, we incentivize reduced consumption in lots and lots of ways. And this is just one of them, but there would be many, many more.
Well, yes, I would add to what Richard has said by saying that this is just another element of what needs to be done. And we have to highlight not just the symptoms, but the disease
Recording
rather.
stopped.
And it's worrisome because although...
Recording in progress.
Well, that's good. That's good that we're recording. So although these characteristics, as we said, are desirable, we have to do more than that. We have to go beyond that. So all of these can simply be excuses to try and put a patch on things. So these are not bad measures. I think it's a good beginning, but we have to go further than that. We have to go beyond that. And leaving our Europe centrism aside, let's, Slavia Salinas was asking if that degrowth could be introduced in developing countries, because obviously we are talking about a society such as ours, which is developed. So, Richard, what do you think about this?
Yes, I mean, from the standpoint of justice and fairness, one would like to see the world's poorest countries grow in terms of per capita consumption and so on. And of course, it's the obligation of the world's wealthy countries to enable that to happen. Unfortunately, however, we're in a situation where the world's wealthy countries are now confronting the end of growth, and they will be consolidating and using whatever resources they have to maintain their current levels of consumption, and are not going to be in position to offer help, as much help to poorer countries for them to increase their consumption. And it's going to be more and more difficult for them to do so. There's another taboo word that we haven't mentioned up until now. We've talked about depletion and rationing. Another taboo word is population. We need to, of course, this is not a quick solution to our problem. Reducing population growth or reducing population altogether in a controlled, gradual, and humane manner is not a quick fix to the situation that we're in. There's a momentum of population growth that will likely continue for some time. But the more that population continues to grow, the more difficult it will be for those who are around 10, 20, 50 years from now. And this is especially true in many poorer countries that have high rates of population growth. It's one of the cheapest ways that we have of ensuring that those people will have decent lives in the future is to assist with whatever efforts are underway to reduce population growth in those countries. But this is a subject that needs to be tackled also in the world's rich countries, even where population is hardly growing at all, or even already starting to decline. We have to find ways to normalize population decline and make it more easily make it easier to adjust to population decline on the part of demographic trends with younger and older people, how many people are in the workforce, and so on. We need to come to terms with this because it's going to happen one way or another anyway. But if we do the thinking and the adjustment now, it makes it, again, much easier in the long run.
Que ya ha comentado Richard.
Richard has already said, I would say that with degrowth, the thing is that it's not something that can be chosen or not. It's going to happen whether we want it or not. So obviously, it's going to affect both developed and developing countries and underdeveloped countries. And I think that because of the value of justice, degrowth needs to be much more intense in rich countries. And there will be some countries that will have to grow. And that is something that we need to accept because that is the way things have to work. But in any case, the only solution for this is to let countries behave as they should, because they will find their ways to reach stability. Because let's not forget that of all the different rhythms of growth and degrowth, we see that we the rich countries are we are getting or appropriating those resources from poorer countries. So if we have a fair trade, we will allow for a balancing of the situation. And as for population, yes, I think that that is a critical problem. Absolutely. But it's also a taboo word. He's absolutely right. And even more so when a white Western world man is uttering it. So it's a very slippery slope and very dangerous slope. So it's always them who ask for the population to be reduced. It's complicated. I think that the key for population is the following. The planet has a load capacity, and we might have exceeded it. Maybe there is more population than what the planet can actually withstand. We need to land this smoothly and in a humane way. We have to do it in a humane way, as Richard was saying. So that is why I think that energy resources will be present for a very long time. Even if they degrow, they will be abundant. But we need to manage this degrowth in order to land this decrease of population. But we have to plan for it to take place. And we also have to understand that in many countries, the best way to control the population in an efficient way and to maintain it within the right framework is by empowering women. Because when women are free from certain oppression, they usually make the right decisions about their own body and about their own fertility. So I do think that sometimes it's simpler to establish measures that are not as costly, such as, for instance, simply education, values. It's not simple. I know it's not simple because obviously that's also very difficult. But usually you get more than by other costly methods, but it's very risky. So if we don't act, there will be collapse, there will be hunger, there will be war. And that's the risk that we need to fight against. We need to try and control it whenever possible. So it's a very grim landscape you're painting here, but we're talking about society. Let's also talk about companies. Juan Valiente was saying that if companies needed to put in place constant measures in their P&L results on a yearly basis, that obviously will cause for shareholders to see a decrease in their assets. So shareholders would withdraw their money from the companies. Then there would be a decapitalization of the companies. Those companies would close. There wouldn't be investments. New technologies would not be born. So how should the entrepreneurial fabric understand this degrowth scenario? Can I answer first? May I? Yes, of course. So what this person is describing is something that is already happening. That is already happening exactly due to the reasons that he is stating here. So we have to understand something. The capitalist model with a profit rate is only something that can happen when there is growth. And the benefit will only grow when there is growth. But since we're going towards a world where there will be degrowth, then this model will no longer be valid, and it will be dysfunctional. It would simply accelerate the problems that we currently have. So how can we offset this? Well, I think that the only way is to try and go towards a system, a production system that is localized and that does not really depend on foreign investment. And it's very easy to say this when you're not a company, but it's the only thing that would be stable. In the current context, what we expect is for companies to have losses, and that is what is happening. So the future should be renewable energies. You know that manufacturing companies are closing down their factories because they see that they're not profitable. Or LG, for instance, which is a giant in the world of electronics, has decided to abandon the sector of PV cells because they don't get any benefits. Well, that is the situation that we will be in, and that's what we will see in the next few years. So we have to adapt ourselves. We have to adapt that which is viable and that which is not growing. And it's very difficult. So we have to see how we can land these ideas, well, by satisfying total scale and then limiting our exposure to other people's capitals. You cannot get your ideas flying with other people's investment. So since growth will not be possible, we have to be self-contained. And I know it's very complex. It's not simple, and it's not simple to set up either. Richard, would you like to add something to that?
Yeah, I agree with everything Antonio just said. Smaller businesses, I think, can, as he was saying, can continue to be profitable within a local context. But some industries that are providing essential goods and services for society as a whole, if they're going to continue, I think they will have to be nationalized. And I think this is true of much of the energy industry in the final analysis. It's going to have to be nationalized because it's going to be less and less profitable for the companies themselves and for investors. So I don't think that the future is, I don't think the best path to the future is one that's entirely doctrinaire in the way that we're usually accustomed to thinking of socialism or capitalism. And I think we're going to have to find hybrid solutions that are appropriate to the circumstance and appropriate to the problem.
Bueno, estamos llegando ya al final de la jornada, la verdad es que...
this webinar. We could go on and on and on because there are so many questions that have been asked via the chat. There are lots of questions. But there is one question that I would also like to ask that Miguel Hernández Lucas is asking, which is what can we do from an individual standpoint? Because we always think about companies, societies, countries, geographical areas, but what is it we can do individually? Richard, for instance.
Well, yes, start to examine your own life in terms of consumption and priorities. My wife and I have been doing this for the last 20 years. We put solar panels on our roof over 20 years ago, and now they're antiques. They're not as efficient as they used to be, but we've had 20 years of experience in maintaining our electricity usage at a level that can be supplied by the panels on our roof. And that's very useful, practical experience. It's not simple. It's not easy reducing your consumption. It takes planning. It takes ingenuity, and it requires trade-offs. It requires thought about how you're going to make your choices from day to day, how you're going to live. So start to get used to that, because that's your future.
Sí, a ver, yo, aparte de lo que ha dicho Richard,
Beside what Richard has just said, and I completely agree with what he has said, you have to plan your consumption, but you also have to consider your exposure, because that's what we're seeing in Spain, for instance, with our energy invoices, our bills that are very, very high, that are having an impact on everything, but they're also having an impact on the stability of companies, and it is difficult to maintain supply. So I think that measures need to be made individually. For instance, you have to improve your financial exposure, obviously, as much as you can. And you also have to change your mindset and understand that you have to make changes in your professional life. You're going to have to do things that are different to those that you thought you would be doing. You have to understand that profound changes are going to take place. And one of the problems that this situation entails are psychological problems, because it's a situation where you're at a loss. You are in a situation of despair. And in many cases, when people are pushed to unemployment, for instance, there is usually lots of guilt. People think they're responsible for a problem that in many cases has external causes to it. So we need to have that psychological resilience. We need to understand the moment we are going through. And then, I'm really sorry, says Antonio. So, and then from a level of higher structures, we have to relocalize production. I mean, companies have to localize. For instance, everything that has to do with material supply, it has to come from local places. We have to try and not depend on other people's investments. We have to be very vigilant with regards to the evolution of the market, to not take risky decisions, try not to set objectives that are not feasible. And then from another level, not just companies, but from a collective standpoint, I think it is important to set up resilient societies. We have to help each other. We have to create close-knit communities that will give us the capacities that we need to overcome these problems, because it's not just the energy crisis and materials crisis. There's also climate change and environmental problems, and that is all there, and it is not going to disappear, not now. So we have to help each other from a community standpoint. And then what we need to understand, because this happens a lot in Spain, not so much in the US because it's a more democratic society, but we know that we have to try and have an influence on our on our politicians, on our civil servants. We have to have an influence on them. We have to try to have that. We have to insist and insist and insist. We need that pedagogy. We cannot just stop working on that. We need to force for that debate to take place, and it has to be tackled in a serious way. Okay, so we run out of time, but I would like to close with one last question. If you could answer as briefly as possible, because it helps us make the link with our next debate, which will be on May 11th at 6 in the afternoon. That will talk about the construction of the post-growth conversation between Tim Jackson and Yayo Herrero. But I would like to close with our two experts here today by asking them a question. I want to know if the capitalist system is viable, and if we have other options. If you could be brief when answering this question, I would appreciate it, and we will close with that. Thank you very much. Richard, please.
Yes, I think it is possible for capitalism to survive the end of growth, but the form that capitalism takes under those circumstances is hideous. Things like profiting from the misery of others, kidnapping for ransom, and so. I mean, these are profitable enterprises, but we certainly don't want to see more of that kind of thing. The era in which capitalism can operate the economy as a whole for the benefit of most people most of the time, that is coming to an end. We have to think of new economic systems and new economic models for the post-growth era. And I think trying to be doctrinaire about that, as I said earlier from the start, and assume that they will follow the lines of socialist economies that from the past or ones that currently exist, may be reducing our options unnecessarily. We need to think outside the box.
Bueno, yo sobre esto el problema es la definición de capitalismo, ¿no? Porque normalmente se entiende capitalismo como una economía de mercado, etcétera. Yo no me parece que ese sea el rasgo que lo define, por lo menos.
Market philosophy, I don't think that that is what defines it. At least what we are here considering is is maintaining the profit rate, and that cannot be maintained. It will not be maintained. So capitalism as a system that is based on capital income cannot be maintained. As Richard said, it cannot continue. But that does not mean that it will be completely dismantled. We will not dismantle all of the structures that we have. We could maintain it, and private property will be maintained, and the market as well, or not. It depends on how we react in each country. But I do understand, or I do think that what we understood as communist systems in the world have the same problems with productivism and growth and so on, and it's unsustainable, just like the capitalism as we understood it previously. So we need to see an evolution. I completely agree that we have to build something that is completely new, and it is important for it to be done with a social consensus. We need to have everyone's agreement. That is obviously difficult, but I think we need to evolve, and there are certain ideas that I believe are interesting, such as the Herman Daly's state economy, or everything that has to do with ecological economy, and trying to include the economic process within the limits of the planet. But then there are aspects that are political aspects, and in some places they will turn to collectivist systems, others will turn to individualistic systems. That will just depend on each country, but that's not really a physical need. Okay, so we really reached the end. It has really been a very interesting conversation, and all the participants were really very active during this webinar. We need to keep on talking about this topic. We really need to talk about this. It needs to be discussed. We need to get the word out there. We need for this to be on the table. It's something that needs to have our attention, because we don't talk about this enough, but with experts like you, I know that it will be possible for this to be tackled more often. Do you want to close with something? Yes, I need to close with something. Considering that my first lectures about this were actually through Richard's books, it has been an honor for me. I do not deserve being here today with him, but I really want to thank you for the opportunity. Thank you both so much. And I just wanted to remind you all that on May 11th, we will be back here talking about degrowth. Thank you very much.